Prior to the launching of Sputnik, education was at a standstill in America. Once Americans realized they were falling behind in math and science, President Dwight Eisenhower decided that a change needed to be made in our education system.
To scrutinize your school's curriculum and standards. Then decide for yourselves whether they meet the stern demands of the era we are entering.
The National Defense Education Act was passed in 1958, providing funding to education institutions at all levels.
Eisenhower was not the only president who wanted to reform education. Following him, President Kennedy also believed education was important for our nation. One of his biggest goals was continuing the desegregation of schools.
I say two touchstones, yet they are almost inseparable. Inseparable, if not indistinguishable. For liberty without learning is always in peril, and learning without liberty is always in vain.
Kennedy also believed in the separation of church and state and helped pass the Higher Education Act of 1963, which governed the administration of federal student aid.
President Johnson continued to reform education by focusing and spending a lot of money on programs for disadvantaged students. Though he didn't get much done, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was passed in 1965, which emphasized full educational opportunity.
After President Johnson, Nixon and Ford made many promises for educational reform that were not fulfilled. Both favored private schooling and believed prayer should be allowed in all schools.
Contrary to President Nixon and President Ford, President Carter strongly opposed religion in public school, especially science. He also favored public education and believed the government should pay a higher percentage of funding for public schools.
In 1983, President Reagan had a lot of goals for educational reform, including the proposed abolishment of the Department of Education. He strongly supported vouchers and encouraged college education for all Americans. Though he had big ideas, many of them failed.
Like President Reagan, Bush Sr. had a lot of big educational goals, such as the idea that in year 2000 all students would be school ready and America would be first in math and science. Also, like Reagan, most of his goals were not achieved.
After Reagan and Bush Sr., President Clinton focused on redesigning failing schools and rewarding successful ones by creating national standards for education and increasing funding to require teacher testing. He saw positive results towards the end of his second term and started initiatives like America Reads and Goals 2000.
Following Clinton, George W. Bush continued to positively reform education through major acts like the Reading First program and No Child Left Behind. He believed public education was America's greatest hope and wanted education to include values and moral responsibility.
Our most recent president, Barack Obama, pushed to add more teachers in high-need areas, increase before and after-school programs, and make math and science a national priority. He wanted to support both early learning and higher education, and believed great teachers needed recognition and support.
Overall, many of our presidents have had educational goals that were not achieved. And though some presidents did make a difference, education in America has a long way to go and ultimately needs less talk and more action.